You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome back to the Past Macabre, where we journey through history to uncover how our relationship with death affects the values, fears, and hopes that shape the way people live. I'm your host, Stephanie Rice. Thank you for joining me for episode 35, Ancient True Crime, the Assassination of Ramesses III. Archaeology is often like trying to solve an incredibly difficult mystery because we only get tiny fragments of evidence. And in this case, it's a proper murder mystery. In this episode, we'll take a look at the archaeological and written evidence of the real-life plot to assassinate the pharaoh and the court case against those accused of participating in the plot. I'll also share details of modern forensic investigations that have been done on the mummies of those involved that we know of that provide evidence to back up the case facts that we have in the sources. Just a warning, this episode may be a bit grim because of the forensic details that I will provide, and I will mention suicide since it's relevant to the full case. True crime vibes, but those may not always be for everyone at every time, so just wanted to give that warning. So if you're ready for my attempt at true crime media, let's get started. On the 14th day of the third month of Shimu of the year 32 by the Egyptian civil calendar, the pharaoh Ramesses III was assassinated. That date is the equivalent of the 15th of April in 1155 BCE by our modern calendar. It was the harvest season for ancient Egypt, which is an important time of year in normal times, but it was especially important this year. Egypt had just experienced several years of failing crops and famine, so things were getting more and more desperate with each new harvest season. The previous day, Ramesses III and his royal retinue had traveled up the Nile from the capital of Pi-Ramses, which is in the delta, and they traveled over 450 miles or 730 kilometers to the area that we now call Luxor, which was Thebes or Waset in ancient Egypt, which is in the south. They arrived at the area now known as Medinet Habu, and this was the site of Ramesses III's future mortuary temple, and it also had a palace here, which is where he stayed for his frequent trips to Thebes for all of the many religious festivals that were held here. This time, he was in town for the beautiful Festival of the Valley. This is a festival that we actually don't know very much about, but we do know that it was a celebration to honor the dead rulers who were buried in the Valley of the Kings. It started in the Middle Kingdom and was especially popular in the New Kingdom. Ramesses was not here to have fun while his people starved here at the beautiful Festival of the Valley. The pharaoh was responsible for maintaining Maat, which is the equivalent of balance, and the times that they were living in were clearly not balanced given the famines that they were experiencing. Religious festivals and the rituals that are performed at them are part of the duties that the pharaoh was required to do in order to maintain Maat. So Ramesses III really needed this festival to go well, and he really needed a successful harvest season this year. On this first day of the festival, the statues of the sun god Amun and the mother goddess Maat and their son Khonsu, the lunar god, were all carried in sacred boats from the temple of Amun in Karnak to the mortuary temples of deceased rulers in the Valley of the Kings, or near the Valley of the Kings. The procession wasn't solemn or quiet like a funeral of modern times, and it also was not exclusive to just the king and high priests, like some sort of super formal religious ceremony. The rare depictions of this procession have lots of people joining, and they celebrated as they went with singing and music, like several musical instruments, clapping and dancing as they went. Food and drink offerings for the deceased were carried along the procession route. And then at the end of the parade, after they got to the mortuary temples of all of the past rulers and they gave their offerings, there were tons of things for the living too. There was food and beer and wine, and they would celebrate with the dead. These celebrations would go on into the night as late as possible, just like many modern large celebrations would. But this year, Ramses III decided to retire to his room at the top of the western tower that was at his palace. And that was his very last day in the land of the living. That evening, he met a very bloody end. All great true crime media has a victim profile. So, Ramses III was the second pharaoh of the 20th dynasty. It was a dynasty that was established with regicide in the wake of a succession crisis. So Ramses III's own father, Setnacht, was a usurper. He had violently deposed the last ruler of Dynasty 19, and so maybe this was a sins of the father type of motive here. Ramses III ruled for about 32 years, around 1187 to 1155 BCE, based on our calendar. He was already an adult when he was crowned, so he was actually in his late 50s or early 60s when he died. And he had 10 sons that we know about based on what's known as the procession of princes at Medinet Habu, which shows 10 sons, but they were not named at the time that the depictions were originally made in Ramses III's lifetime. The names were actually placed later by his successor. So we don't know 100% how true the order of them all is, but we know there were at least 10 sons. But the longer Ramses III lived, the more of them he outlived. 4 of his eldest sons had already died by his 32nd year. And so maybe some people became involved in the plot to kill him out of fear of another succession crisis, like what happened after Ramses II in the 19th dynasty, which ultimately is what led to the creation of the 20th dynasty. Even though they share the name Ramses, Ramses III was not actually related to Ramses II. That was more of an attempt to add legitimacy to the new royal line by connecting them to the previous one. When Ramses III ascended the throne, it was a very chaotic period for the entire Mediterranean region. Archaeologists and historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse because pretty much every known civilization at the time in the Mediterranean region was collapsing. Ramses III had to defend Egypt against multiple invasions from other cultures that had been shoved out of their own lands by their turmoil, so it kind of created this large cycle of military strife and political strife all over the region. Plus, under his rule, there were multiple years where crops didn't grow, which is extra bad in a period where the main form of currency is grain. People were not getting paid in coin in Egypt during this period. It wasn't really until the Ptolemaic period and way later. The grain rations were used to pay soldiers. They were used to pay all of the royal officials. They were used to pay the tomb artisans and the tomb builders, etc., etc. But now, without any new grain being harvested and having to deal with a lot of military actions as he was defending Egypt, the royal stores were drained to the point where Ramses III could no longer pay workers. At Deir el-Medina, which is the workers' village for the artisans who made the royal tombs, there was the first recorded labor strike in history during Ramses III's reign. They even marched while chanting their demands, and they held sit-ins at some of the royal tombs. So they are the original protest strike icons. I love that this is something that is still done today. People are so similar throughout time. And all of this could have been possible motives for the assassination as well, given how much unrest was going on through so many different places and parts of Egypt. Thanks to multiple written sources, archaeological excavations that have been done at Medina Habu, and modern forensic techniques, I can actually walk you through pieces of the ancient crime scene and the investigation. I'll start with a bit of info about the text sources. The primary source of our information about this plot is an ancient document known as the Turin Judicial Papyrus, and it's named that because it's now at the Egyptian Museum in Turin, Italy. Legal documents are not rare finds amongst papyri from dynastic Egypt. All sorts have been found, but this one is unique and gives us an incredibly rare glimpse behind the golden, nearly perfect facade of kingship in ancient Egypt. The judicial papyrus is essentially a summary of the entire case written after it was closed, since it includes the names of all of the conspirators and their sentences. It doesn't have a lot of details about each step of the investigation, but luckily we do have two more papyrus fragments that detail the conspiracy, and they were found and translated a couple of years after the Turin Judicial Papyrus. These two are known as Papyrus Roland and Papyrus Lee, and they're named after the collectors who bought them in Egypt before they were donated to the various museums that they exist at now. I believe one is actually still in a private collection, but I'm not too sure on that. Unlike the bureaucratic and to-the-point language within the Turin Judicial Papyrus, these two provide more of a narrative reconstruction of the assassination plot, though they are not complete, and so we only get fragments of it. The language that's used in these fragments is much more metaphoric or poetic than anything in the legal documents, and they reference magic used in this plot while still providing facts from the case. For a modern comparison, they read kind of like the reveal at the end of a supernatural murder mystery. But that shouldn't actually be taken literally. These are actually just a lot of poetic expressions and old-timey sentence structures, sort of like if you're trying to read something in Old English. So they aren't saying magic was literally used to carry out this assassination. It's more of a way to describe the situation. When I get to parts of the investigation where Papyrus Roland and Papyrus Lee are relevant, I'm just going to provide a summary of what they say without the poetic expressions or the implications of magic, but I will be providing a link to their full translations in the show notes, so that's also why I wanted to give you a bit of a heads up that they sound very magical and almost fictitious, but we know for a fact that they are related to this same judicial papyrus. Also, a quick note on the names of the conspirators that will be in all of the sources, because it'll get a bit annoying if I repeat myself after each one, but none of these names were their real names. They are negative fake names. I'll provide the translations as I go, as I introduce people so that you can kind of see that, but this also wasn't just a choice for this individual case, so to give you some context. This was actually a part of capital punishment in ancient Egypt. Because a person's name was very, very important to them, they called it Ren, and it's considered a distinct part of a complete human soul, and the soul must be complete to live eternally in the paradise of Aru, or the field of reeds. Denying the conspirators their names was one of the ways that they were blocked from eternal life, in addition to their physical punishments, so it would have been ordered that no one could continue writing their true names down. For example, there's an ostracon recovered by the University of Chicago that dates to the time of Ramesses III's death, and it relates to one of the conspirators. We can tell based on the dating and the phrasing used in it. Ostraca pieces are pieces of pottery that were reused to write on, usually for records that were kept by tradesmen or crafters or fishermen in this case. Papyrus was not easy to come by and used pretty much only by the temples and the royals. This one was a work log from Deir el Medina, which is near the Valley of the Kings and near Medinet Habu, where all of the assassination took place. Deir el Medina was the workers' village. And this work log includes a receipt for 190 fish that were for the beautiful feast of the valley. But it says that the payment was made by Pa-Enesin, which roughly translates to the one of rebellion. Definitely not a real name. There's never been any example of someone given that as a real name throughout all of the texts we have from Egypt. But Egypt was very bureaucratic, and purchases on this scale still needed to have receipts. And so even though this transaction was done by one of these convicted conspirators, the workmen still needed to keep track of that and where payment went for it. So they had to do it this way. And another note on the sources, they never made it clear exactly how Ramses III died, and that's why the modern forensic information comes into play. In fact, the sources didn't even make it clear whether or not Ramses died at all in the assassination attempt. For a while, many researchers believed that Ramses had survived because the Turin judicial papyrus is written from Ramses III's point of view, as if he was the one ordering the investigation against an attempt on his life. There's also no one named as directly responsible for the death of Ramses or even directly an assassination. They are all charged with inciting rebellion or for learning of the plot and failing to report it. We only know that there was an attempt on Ramses' life because it's mentioned in the portions of the text where he is ordering this investigation. But then we have Papyrus Roland and Papyrus Lee, and Papyrus Lee specifically references him as if Ramses III is already dead by the time it was written, and we know it came about around the time of the investigation. So that left Egyptologists with many more questions than they had answers at the time. The translations of these sources happened in the 1860s, and at that time, Ramses III's mummy had not even been found yet. In 1886, almost 20 years after the translation of the judicial papyrus, which was the first one, was initially published, the mummy of Ramses III was finally discovered in a cache of royal mummies that had been moved from their original tombs into a single place at Deir el-Bahri. With this discovery, medical professionals could finally examine Ramses III and try to identify his cause of death. They unwrapped his mummy as far as they could. They left a lot of the wrappings still done, luckily, because it helped to preserve his mummy. Unfortunately, a lot of mummy unwrappings led to the disintegration of a lot of mummies over time. Based on the medical knowledge and the technology of the 1880s and 1890s, the doctors who examined Ramses III saw no evidence of assassination on his remains. But one thing remained off about the mummy of Ramses III that researchers couldn't quite explain. He had been mummified with a much thicker layer of bandages around his neck than most mummies usually had. So in 2012, the case was reopened, and modern CT scans revealed the true cause of death of Ramses III was exsanguination due to sharp force trauma to the neck that cut through the trachea, esophagus, and major blood vessels down to the 5th through 7th cervical vertebrae. In other words, his throat was slit so deeply that he was nearly decapitated, and he bled to death almost instantly. At the time, a different blade, likely an axe, was used to cut off his left big toe, because there's no evidence of the healing of that wound. So, once and for all, researchers knew for a fact that the assassination attempt had been successful. Now, with that forensic evidence in mind, let's get back to the details of the investigation that we know from the written sources. The Turin Judicial Papyrus names 14 investigators who were appointed, and it seems like they were quickly set to the task of finding out how an assassin could make it into the king's chambers and close enough to slit his throat. Since there are going to be quite a few names within the list of conspirators, I won't throw out a bunch more to confuse things, but I will include links to the full translation of the papyrus in the show notes for anyone who is interested in learning a lot more details and all of the names that are provided in it. The investigation exposed a highly coordinated plot that was brewing within Ramses III's inner court right as he was focused on conflicts at Egypt's borders and the unrest amongst the public. So this wasn't an attack of opportunity. They had planned to exploit his vulnerability at Medinet Habu, which was the very place intended to be his eternal sanctuary, the place where he could let his guard down. Now, given the amount of blood that would have been caused by the type of wound that he sustained, the assassination was not subtle. Plus, the judicial papyrus implies a coordinated military uprising at the same time or immediately following the death of Ramses III. One of the theories proposed for why his left big toe was cut off is that that was possibly needed as proof that the king was dead so that the next phase of the uprising could begin, possibly that military phase. A militant uprising couldn't have happened before the death of Ramses, because if fighting had started, he wouldn't have been left vulnerable enough for someone to get in close and cut his throat. The sources don't specify how far the plot got by the time that they were stopped, but obviously the perpetrators thought that this would go very quickly and very easily for them. And since they were making such bold moves, this meant that the investigators were quickly able to identify the three main conspirators. Queen Ta, one of Ramses III's wives, who did not have an elite background, and so in some academic sources she would be referred to as a secondary wife. The chief of the chamber, who was supposed to be one of the officials closest to the king, since his job would be to manage both the royal household and any private business that the king had. And the third was the royal butler, who would have been in charge of managing all of the household staff. Now, in the sources, the chief of the chamber is referred to as Pebekamen, which means the blind servant, and the royal butler is referred to as Mesed Sure, which means hated by Ra. Ta is the only exception within the documents because her real name is used. Even though she no longer has a tomb that we can find or any monuments, nor is she named anywhere associated with Ramses III other than these documents, we do know that this was her real name because this was a documented name for other women in Egypt and other wives of previous rulers in Egypt, and it translates to great or beloved. You're not really going to give that name to someone who you're trying to forget forever. So she was given a bit of a pass there. She's also the only woman named in the text. There are 6 other women who are convicted, but they are just listed as wives of the guards. And Ta is also the only one whose exact charges and sentence aren't named at all. So we actually have no idea what ultimately happened to her after the plot all unfolded and everybody was sentenced. Again, other than the fact that we don't have evidence of her in the wider archaeological record. So clearly she wasn't allowed to just carry on the way things were. For reasons not explained in the sources, we do know that the goal of the coup was not just to end the seemingly cursed reign of Ramses III, but to also install a completely different prince on the throne other than Ramses IV, who had been chosen to be crown prince by Ramses III many years before his death. So again, this was not a sort of quick burn emotional reaction to something or an attack of opportunity. This plan had been going on in motion for a while, and everybody knew for a while who the intended successor was. Queen Ta's son would normally have had no claim to the throne, so maybe her motives were purely personal. Given that she didn't hold any important titles nor have any royal blood connection, becoming the king's mother would be a huge boost to her status and that of her extended family for generations. Or maybe her motives were more altruistic, and she thought that going in a completely different direction would actually restore Maat to Egypt. Or it's also possible that she and her son had been manipulated into the plot, and others intended to control the new king completely themselves. Papyrus Roland suggests that might be the case because at least one of the investigators clearly believed that Pybekamen had manipulated many people and was to blame for the entire plot. It actually includes a couple prayers to Ra, wishing that Ra had never allowed Pybekamen to be hired to the job that actually allowed him to get this kind of access to the king. And then, towards the end of it, one prayer even is wishing that Ra hadn't even let Pybekamen survive childhood. So whether it was one of the investigators or a scribe documenting on behalf of the investigators, the author of Papyrus Roland clearly believed that Pybekamen was responsible, and if he had not been there, Ramses III would have still been alive. So the sources reveal that even though any one of the three main conspirators could easily get physically close to the king, more than any other person probably, it seems that none of them were the ones who actually killed Ramses III with their own hands. According to Papyrus Lee, one of the investigators uncovered forged official documents that allowed someone, or possibly multiple people, to bypass the main gate at Medinet Habu, and then they were able to enter through a side door that led them through the harem to the king's chambers. Hence why it's called the harem conspiracy. Not only was one of the queens involved, but it also happened essentially within the harem. Papyrus Lee also says that the plot relied on the chaos of the festival and the assumption that most people would be out partying instead of being in the palace. Plus, several officials in charge of this part of the king's household, the harem part, are named as conspirators in the judicial papyrus. So it would seem that once the assassin was inside through this side door, they wouldn't have to worry about running into many people who weren't in on the plot already. So those forged documents were mostly to get them past the gates to that side door. Sadly, the fragment that remains does not include the name of who wrote the forged documents, or who received them, or who used them. And overall, investigators identified 22 people involved with the conspiracy, including Pybekamen and Mesedzure. Again, TA is not included in this count because we have no idea what happened to her after her involvement in the initial plot. These 22 were tried, sentenced, and executed in a way that would specifically destroy their body in order to prevent them from entering to the afterlife, such as impalement or burning. Remember, you have to be complete in the ancient Egyptian belief system in order to get to the afterlife. That includes spiritually, physically, all aspects of it. But that wasn't actually the end of the investigation. As the investigators continued looking into things and questioning the people who were going to be executed, more and more people were found to be in cahoots with the would-be usurpers. Among them was Pais, who was former commander of the army until he was charged. He and several unnamed women, after being charged with this conspiracy involvement, had managed to bribe the captain of police, an infantry officer, and 3 of the investigators in order to try to get themselves out of trouble. They were almost in the clear, but towards the end of the investigation, they somehow got caught. The only acquittal in the entire judicial papyrus is one of the 3 bribed investigators, so maybe he struck a deal and gave up his fellows. And you might be wondering why I haven't mentioned the punishment doled out to the prince who would be king yet. And it's because he's given a very curious position within the judicial papyrus. He's referred to as Pentawer in the sources, which roughly translates to the accused or the fugitive. And in the Turin Judicial Papyrus specifically, it refers to him as to whom had been given that other name, implying his given name had been stripped from him. But curiously, he was not included in the first trial with all of the main conspirators that were initially tried, including his own mother, theoretically. He was at least not named alongside her in that initial trial, and he also wasn't executed. He was eventually tried in the 3rd trial that took place, so he even came along after the corrupt military guy Pais. And he was only tried alongside people who were charged with just knowing about the plot and not reporting it, not any of the main conspirators. He was also allowed to take his own life, which was seen as the better option and considered a light punishment in his situation, since that would mean that his body wouldn't be destroyed by fire or wounds. According to ancient Egyptian beliefs, that meant that he still had a fighting chance to make it to the field of reeds instead of being completely blocked out. For a while, some researchers believed that Pentawer had been a young child when the attempted coup happened, given that he wasn't tried alongside the leaders of the plot, and he was granted a lenient sentence. But in the same 2012 study of the mummy on Ramses III, researchers actually confirmed that another mummy found in the same cache, previously known as Unknown Man E, or the Screaming Mummy, was actually an adult son of Ramses III and was most likely Pentawere. The main evidence for his identity comes from the fact that despite being found in a royal cache surrounded by only royal mummies that had been removed from royal tombs, this mummy was not given any proper burial rites. He was wrapped in goat skin, which was considered very impure in ancient Egypt, and it would have never been used in an honorable burial, let alone a royal burial. Further investigation using CT scans showed evidence that he had not even been properly mummified. All of his organs had been left in him, and when he was buried, they just kind of left him as is, wrapped in that sheepskin. And honestly, his preservation is due to luck and weather conditions more than any attempts to keep him preserved. That's something that would not have been done to anyone of royal blood unless they had done something pretty terrible. That was an incredibly huge dishonor. And again, you still sort of had a chance to be able to get into the field of reeds, but it's getting harder and harder for poor Pentawere here. But despite all of that dishonor, his burial place was remembered by someone, and it was still close enough to Ramses III's tomb that his mummy was moved to the same cache with the father he helped to usurp. The mummies in that cache had been moved there to protect them, so somebody remembered that he was worth protecting on some level. Given that we now know Ramses III died very quickly and did not order the investigation into his own assassination attempt, and that it was Ramses IV, it's even more interesting. What would inspire Ramses IV to still give his half-brother / potential assassin as well? Theoretically, they weren't going to let him keep on living. These sorts of half-burial rites. Now that we know Pentawere was most likely aged 18 to 30, that actually puts him fairly close in age to Ramses IV. Given that they're half-brothers, it's entirely possible they are very close in age and they grew up together. So maybe there's a bit of sentimentality behind it. Could also be political. It's entirely possible that some concessions had to be made in order to quell the rest of the rebellion that they couldn't root out amongst all of the trials and investigations. In the end, 32 people, including the prince, we don't know about TA, so she's not in that count once again, 32 people were sentenced to death for either participating in the plot or for knowing about it and not reporting it. And we are unfortunately still left guessing as to who actually did the deed and killed Ramses III, because none of the sources identify specifically who was even in the king's chamber when it happened, or even who discovered him. So I guess there is still some mystery to this ancient half-cold case. The answers were there before, and then we lost them, and now we've still got a bit more to find. Who knows, perhaps excavations in the future will unearth some more evidence of this assassination plot, and we'll be able to fill in even more of the pieces that we no longer know. Thank you for joining me for episode 35 and this dabble into the true crime media. I hope you enjoyed this look at the assassination of Ramses III and the evidence that we have of this very intriguing plot. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to keep up with new releases. Please leave a rating and a comment. That helps the show reach others who may be interested in the Past Macabre. For access to bonus content from all Archaeology Podcast Network shows, become a member at archpodnet.com/members. That's archpodnet.com/members. You can find show notes for this and other episodes at archpodnet.com/TPM and follow Past Macabre on Instagram. That's PAST_MACABRE. You'll find pictures of the sites and artifacts discussed, Q&A sessions, and episode topic votes. Hope to see you there.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultural Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.